Lester Holt remembers his legacy.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
He went from being Jimmy Who to winning the White House itself, then struggled with crises overseas and a troubled economy at home. A one-term president whose time as ex-president was the longest.
Thank you all.
Among the most active in American history, becoming the first American president to celebrate his 100th birthday. James Earl Carter Jr., he always went by Jimmy, was born in small-town Plains, Georgia, growing up on a farm without electricity or indoor plumbing. He attended the U.S. Naval Academy, studied nuclear physics, worked in the nuclear submarine program. Carter married Rosalind Smith, a friend of his sister's, and she became his lifelong partner. When his father died, Carter left his military career and went home to run the family peanut farm. But he wanted something more. He got into politics, Georgia state senator, then governor.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
In the Old South, Carter was something new.
The time for racial discrimination is over.
He attracted national attention.
Would our first challenger enter and sign in, please?
But was still enough of an unknown in 1973 to appear on What's My Line? 1 year later,
I'd like to announce that I am a candidate for president.
After Watergate, the country was ready for a Washington outsider who said America deserved a government as good as its people. A born-again Christian who promised voters, "I will never lie to you."
We now have a projected winner, James Earl Carter of the state of Georgia, elected the next president of the United States.
Carter narrowly defeated Gerald Ford, becoming the first president from the Deep South in more than a century.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
He started with a common touch, an inaugural walk to the White House, a cardigan sweater to talk to the nation about the energy crisis.
There's no way that I or anyone else in the government can solve our energy problems if you are not willing to help.
He became a champion of human rights.
No member of the United Nations can claim that mistreatment of its citizens is solely its own business.
And the Camp David Accord showed Carter at his best, idealistic, tenacious, leading marathon talks between Egypt's Anwar Sadat and Israel's Menachem Begin, achieving a peace treaty that is still in place today. But closer to home, Carter's inexperience and his distaste for political rough and tumble became serious handicaps. And when the economy tanked, so did Carter's popularity. He seemed to blame Americans themselves.
The erosion of our confidence in the future.
He looked weak, photographed collapsing during a run. And it got worse. In Iran, scores of Americans were taken hostage.
I'm a candidate for president of the United States.
Ted Kennedy announced he would challenge Carter for the nomination. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan, prompting Carter to boycott the Moscow Olympics. Above all, the hostage crisis consumed Carter's final year in office.
Any encouraging news from Iran as president? No.
A mission to rescue the hostages ended in tragedy.
8 Americans had died, an unknown number of other Americans had been wounded.
It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation. The responsibility is fully my own.
Still hoping for a second term, Carter beat Kennedy, only to face an even more formidable opponent.
I'll bring new hope to America.
Ronald Reagan projected optimism and confidence, and he didn't think much of Carter.
There you go again.
Jimmy Carter lost in a landslide. And though he finally negotiated the release of the hostages, they weren't officially freed until just after he left office. Through it all, Carter was sustained by his faith.
You were faced with some huge crises as president. Did you drop down to your knees and pray?
Often, yes, often. In fact, I prayed more per day, per hour, while I was president than any other 4 years in my life.
And his defeat marked the beginning of a remarkable post-presidency. He established the Carter Center, committed to advancing human rights and democracy. He even got some respect from an old adversary.
You gave of yourself to this country.
gracing the White House with your passion and intellect and commitment. For that, Mr. President, I thank you, and your country thanks you.
Carter built houses for the poor. He monitored elections, battled disease, and worked for peace around the world, sometimes at odds with his successors. He wrote dozens of books, and in 2002 was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. An extraordinary ex-president, proud of his years in the White House.
Kept the peace. We never went to war. We told the truth. Never lied to the American people. Never misled the American people. So in general terms, I feel perfectly at ease with my term.
Carter was diagnosed with cancer, determined to beat it while maintaining his typical collected demeanor.
I think I have been as blessed as any human being in the world. Everything's been a blessing for me. So I'm thankful and hopeful.
Despite the diagnosis, he continued building houses alongside Rosalind and marked their 75th wedding anniversary in 2021.
75 years, I can't predict.
Rosalind died 2 years later, marking the longest presidential marriage in history. In 2024, Carter marked another milestone, his 100th birthday, with an outpouring of gratitude for his life of service. He brought that devotion to everything he did for family and for country until the end.
Our Lester Holt remembering Jimmy Carter. I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, who is joining us now on the phone. She knew the former president. And Andrea, you saw so much of his life and legacy there. Surrounded by family, the Carter Center says he died at his home of Plains, Georgia. He's been in hospice there for nearly 2 years. And his kids say he will be remembered as a hero to them and to so many around the world.
Indeed. And I covered the Carter White House and covered him since he left the presidency, and as Lester was recounting and as history will record, he was a great ex-president. Certainly his legacy larger once he left the White House, but certainly in the White House we remember the Camp David Accords, 1979, the signing on the North Lawn of the White House. I was on the roof of the Hay Adams Hotel across the way with our then anchor, John Chancellor, and we observed the signing from across the way. And it was just a great moment. And the Camp David Accords certainly set the stage for what has followed for many Middle East agreements and many Middle East tragedies. He was ahead of his time. I interviewed him in Haiti, in Cuba. He was the great human rights advocate. And then for his 100th birthday, there was a grand celebration, a rock and roll concert in Atlanta. We went down there for nightly news, and it was just an extraordinary outpouring. He was really a man for all seasons.
And a man who's being remembered by so many across the country and around the world as well. Andrea Mitchell, our chief Washington correspondent, joining us now on the phone. Andrea, thank you. I want to bring in another NBC News presidential historian, Michael Beschloss, who's with us now. And Michael, the 39th president will be remembered for a lot of things, his presidency, but also his post-presidency period as well. His push for peace, his push for human rights, that Nobel Peace Prize that capped so much of his work.
Right. And, you know, I knew Carter fairly well. And what galled him, oddly enough, Hallie, was when someone would say he was the best ex-president in history. Some people said that sounded like the best restaurant in a hospital. He thought it was sort of an implied insult that his presidency had not been what it should have been. So what Carter used to say is, if you like my ex-presidency, take a look at the values that have driven that ex-presidency, desire for democracy around the world and human rights and racial justice, and you will see those things in my presidency. Oddly enough, Hallie, you know, prophets usually do not have honor in their own time. They don't live to see their resurgence if they're unpopular, as Jimmy Carter was when he was defeated for re-election in 1980, running against Ronald Reagan. He only had a tiny number of electoral votes, but he lived to see the resurgence of interest in Carter and respect for him, and the feeling, just as John Meacham was saying a little bit earlier, that character was important. Final thing, no way that Carter would have been elected president except for it was 1976, and he was following Richard Nixon and Watergate, and the collapse in Vietnam, a war in which presidents had not told Americans the truth, Carter's whole point during that campaign was it is important what kind of human being a president is.
Michael Beschloss. Michael, stand by. Thank you so much. Our Ali Rafa is in West Palm Beach, where she is, of course, following President-elect Trump. She is also, of course, covering the outgoing president, President Joe Biden. And Ali, we know that the last time President Biden saw former President Carter was at Rosalind Carter's funeral back in November of last year. It was a love like few others have had and experienced, as we've reported on so much. At this point, we expect, and we don't have it yet, but we expect naturally statements from the current White House, from the incoming administration as well. Walk us through what your expectations are as, of course, Washington and Plains, Georgia, and the rest of the country prepare to lay Jimmy Carter to rest.
Yeah, as we're all trying to digest this news, Hallie, we're still waiting on reaction from President Biden as well as President-elect Trump, as President Biden is still in St. Croix for the holidays and President-elect Trump remains at his Mar-a-Lago home here in Florida. But we can no doubt expect to see words of praise and admiration for Jimmy Carter, especially from both sides of the aisle, but really throughout the world, for this man who spent his career and even after his presidency, as you're mentioning, for decades trying to make the world a better place. And you mentioned that special relationship that Jimmy Carter had with President Biden. We know he deeply admired him, considered him a very close friend. We know that Carter had even shared advice and guidance with the president and served as somewhat of a valuable asset to him throughout his political career. And you think of the things that they share in common, both being now one-term presidents. And as you mentioned, the last time we saw the two of them together was at Rosalind Carter's funeral. But Hallie, you remember that it was almost 2 years ago now that we saw Jimmy Carter enter hospice care. And unsurprisingly, we've seen him very sparingly since then. We saw him, of course, again at that funeral. We also saw images of him at his 100th birthday in Plains, Georgia in October. And then we learned just 2 weeks later that he had cast his ballot for the last time in a presidential race, voting for Kamala Harris in the 2024 election. So no doubt Jimmy Carter leaving this undeniable legacy, not just for the things he did during his presidency, but the things he did for decades later, really pursuing his passion for human rights, trying to make the world a better place, serving on the board of Habitat for Humanity, establishing in 1982 the Carter Center, and also using, as I mentioned, his expertise as a former president to help subsequent presidents and give them advice. So as far as really what happens now, Hallie, the Carter Center in this new statement is saying that there will be public observances in both Atlanta as well as Washington, D.C., followed by a private interment in Plains, Georgia, of course, the Carter's home. And they say the final arrangements for that state funeral, including all events and motorcade routes, are still pending. All of that to say that with just 22 days left in office, this state funeral and this remembrance service for Jimmy Carter could be one of the last public appearances as president that we see from President Biden. But again, still waiting on reaction from not just President Biden, but also President-elect Trump, who remains at his Mar-a-Lago home here in West Palm Beach. Hallie.
Ali Rafa live for us there in South Florida. Ali, thank you. Andrea Mitchell, our chief Washington correspondent, let me bring you back into the conversation, because for Jimmy Carter, and you interviewed him, you sat down with him, I know, recently, I believe, is just 5 years ago, talking about his push, his support of Habitat for Humanity. To the end, he believed that it was his civic duty to vote, right?
Absolutely. And his post-presidency was so important. His books were all bestsellers. He was lauded around the world, of course, the Nobel Peace Prize for what he did at Camp David. But his example of resilience, and there were, of course, former Carter White House staff people. One said to me when he first went into hospice that he was determined, and as you know, he was there in hospice at home almost 2 years. He stopped taking the chemotherapy, and he wanted to be there for Miss Rosalind. He so adored his wife, and I think he felt that he was hoping to be with her as she was ailing, and certainly she predeceased him, as of course, in November. But the fact that he wanted to be at home And one of his former staff members telling me he wants to live to his 100th birthday. That was a milestone, to be the first president of the United States to turn 100 on October 1st. And the staffer said, and if he doesn't meet that goal, he'll blame me, because he was a tough taskmaster. He was a tough White House boss. At the same time, he was the most accessible person. And despite, of course, the turmoil of the Iran hostage crisis, which so spoiled his presidency and certainly contributed to his loss to Ronald Reagan, one of the things that he wanted to do was to be there to greet the hostages when they returned. So on January 20th, I covered the Reagan inaugural, but he wanted to leave Andrews Air Force Base, fly to Ramstein, and I was sent out to Andrews Air Force Base, where we all watched him board the plane to take, as an ex-president, the military plane, the former Air Force One, which, of course, had passed to Ronald Reagan, and fly at Ronald Reagan's request, and at his request, to fly to Germany to greet the hostages and escort them home. And that was, of course, the trauma of his final year and a half of his presidency.
Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, thank you so much for those memories, for that reporting, for that analysis as well. Let me bring in now our NBC News White House correspondent, Mike Memoli, who's traveling with President Biden while he is on his holiday break in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And Mem, this is just the beginning of what will be extensive coverage, of course, of the life of Jimmy Carter, of the state funeral, the services, both in Washington as well as in Georgia. And it is all but certain that President Biden will play a role in that.
That's right, Hallie. The President's Club is an exclusive one. Only 45 men have ever served as the President of the United States. And so it will fall to the 46th President of the United States, Joe Biden, to lead the country in mourning now for the 39th President. And we have already heard President Biden say publicly in the past that he will deliver one of the eulogies for Carter. And it's appropriate that he would do so, Hallie. This is somebody who, during the breadth of President Biden's long tenure in Washington, he was a young senator just in his early 30s when he was the first senator, the first person, in fact, outside the state of Georgia to endorse then former Governor Carter as he launched his bid for the presidency in 1976. That was the beginning of what remained a very strong relationship between these two men over the decades. And we remember the way that President Biden, in the early months of his presidency, took the trip to Georgia, showed the respect to one of his fellow presidents to visit with both President and Rosalind Carter at their residence in Plains, Georgia, spending the better part of an hour there. He last saw President Carter just a year ago when he traveled again to Georgia to join in the mourning for Rosalind Carter, attending her funeral service. And at the time, President Biden did say that they were able to spend a little bit of a time together, and he was able to tell President Carter how much he loved him. And so as you think now, as President Biden is just himself preparing to leave office, himself a member of the one-term President's Club, the kinship between these two men, I think, will be on display for the country. And there will be certainly, I think, parallels drawn between their time in office, both their work on the foreign policy stage to achieve peace in the Middle East, their work in the closing days as President Biden is trying to achieve a hostage deal himself here for those Americans still in Gaza and Israel, and the ways in which the economic troubles of the country and inflation were part of their political undoing, but the ways in which they ran for office at a searing moment in the history of this country. Carter in the wake of Watergate, President Biden in the wake of impeachments of former president, now soon to be president again, Donald Trump. These are all sort of front of mind as the president will be doing that, leading the country in mourning. I should tell you, Hallie, we have not received yet any word from White House officials about whether we might hear directly from President Biden tonight. You know that there's always the capability for the pool to be summoned, for that to happen, even when he is on vacation. So certainly we'll be keeping you apprised of any change in that. But I would certainly expect to hear at least some form from President Biden, if not in person, but through a paper statement in the evening.
Mike Memoli live for us there at the Virgin Islands. Mike, thank you very much. John Meacham is back with us as well, the distinguished professor of history at Vanderbilt University. And John, these moments, these kinds of funerals, especially for a former president, are significant. They are a moment for the nation to come together, for former presidents to come together to honor one of their own. Talk us through your expectations and the way you see the next few weeks playing out.
It's a great question. presidential funerals, occasions of state, as you say, often tell us as much about the person being honored, or often tells us more about us than about the person being honored. I think about President Reagan, who died on the anniversary of D-Day in 2004, an event that 20 years before he had so powerfully captured. And I think President Carter's death, to some extent, without being overly grand about it, marks part of the end of an era. And the era was one in which, for all of our ferocity, for all of the dissensions and disputes of democracy, former presidents, people of both parties, could come together on big things. We haven't mentioned President Carter and the man he beat, Gerald Ford, became quite close. Became advocates for election reform after 2000. And you played a moment ago that remarkable scene in Atlanta at the opening of the Carter Center where Ronald Reagan saluted the man that he had defeated. That has become ever rarer. And I think President Biden has tried to do all he can to maintain the decorum and dignity of the office. But it's a different time. It's a time when our trust in institutions is ebbing. It's a time, self-evidently, where a dispositive number of American voters chose to have an unconventional figure lead them again in President Trump. And so it will be a kind of a bittersweet moment. I think it'll be a reflective one. I'm sure President Biden will speak from the heart because that is the world from which he comes, a world in which every dispute does not have to be cataclysmic. And so one hopes, and I think President Carter, as a man of faith, would believe this as well, one would hope that these rites, that this commemoration, would do what in religious terms remembrance ideally does, which is not simply lead us to exercise nostalgia, but to remember what is also worth emulating, and to emulate the grace that the Carters brought to the world stage, I think would help us all in this era.
Jon Meacham, we're glad to have you with us tonight, and I know we'll be talking more in the days ahead. Thank you so much for being with us, and thanks to all of you for watching our special coverage of the death of former President Jimmy Carter.